My question to the anti-fascists is, if you really are sincere about a movement, why aren't you open about what you're doing if your cause is just and so forth? Doesn't this all help Trump? It all comes down to this question to me. My fear is that this will get Trump reelected, which I believe that it eventually did, that the media's inability to report on this becomes a liability, not just for the left, but for the media itself. Why are we seeing these things happen online and nobody's telling us what it is?
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. When it comes to the subject of violence in political protests in American cities over the last decade, I have often found myself very confused, and I suspect you suffer from a similar confusion sometimes. I ask myself who these protesters are exactly. Are they regular activists who've gotten a little overactivated? Are they paid protesters? Are they Antifa? Are they Black Bloc? And what do those terms mean anyway? What's the difference? My guest this week is photojournalist Jeremy Lee Quinn. He has spent the last 5 years documenting protests and riots across the country. He was in Santa Monica in 2020. He's covered Portland. He covered the recent unrest in Los Angeles following the ICE raids. And he is a really good source when it comes to this subject. In his forthcoming book, Culture of Confusion, he explores how militant tactics actually take root, how these movements come apart, and why the media so often misses the story. This is a really good interview. We talk about what Jeremy has seen on the ground. I'm going to show you some clips from his footage. We talk about this viral tactic of Black Bloc, what that means. We talk about Molotov cocktails and burned out Waymo cars, to the uneasy overlap between rebellion and performance. This is just a first step towards answering a lot of these questions, but I found it very useful and interesting, and I think you will as well. So I am very pleased to bring you this conversation with Jeremy Lee Quinn. Jeremy Lee Quinn, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You are a photojournalist as well as a regular journalist, the kind that writes things. You cover a lot of stuff. And so I want to cover as much as possible in this interview, but I guess we should start, maybe it's easiest to start just, how you and I met. We were at a conference. We were introduced by a mutual friend, somebody here in LA, who told me that you had been covering a lot of the protests, the mostly peaceful protests around the ICE raids and what's been going on here. The riots, yeah. And I thought, oh, that's fascinating because as somebody who lives here, I have had a really hard time knowing what is actually going on. And I think that extends to so much of what we see in the media these days in terms of like the revolt of the public, like who's revolting, who's not revolting, who's resisting.
And there's this huge vacuum.
Who's the militia? Yes.
So as far as understanding.
Yes, exactly. So why don't you start by telling us kind of what your role is in all of this and why you are interested in this?
So in 2020, I became fascinated with the fact that I, as a local television journalist, I've been an on-camera reporter, but also a cameraman that supports your local TV journalists in Los Angeles and reporters. And in 2020, I was there when Santa Monica got ransacked, May the 31st of 2020. It was a pretty devastating moment in the sense that it was pretty thorough as far as that the police were locked down at the 3rd Street Promenade and the pier. And so you had roving mobs that were able to move eastward from 4th Street unchecked. And the media was pushed out too, because it was just too dangerous. So as we saw, and as I documented it in this last series of riots in Los Angeles, often it's the news van. That's the vehicle that I've driven for most of my career. That gets attacked and is graffitied and, could have its windows bashed out and so forth. So that day in Santa Monica was extremely dangerous. And I saw my colleagues, people who I had worked with at other stations, going in the opposite direction. They were getting away from the rioting because they were being pulled out. Quite simply, it was too volatile. But that day, I wasn't working. I'd been furloughed from COVID. And similarly, I wasn't working I had 4 days off during this LA thing in June. And when you're not working, when you're not on the clock for anybody, all of a sudden you can be there with your phone and you can get so close. And if you know where to look, you can see who's doing this. And when I say who's doing it, I mean, there are tactics that are viral, that are coordination efforts to cause chaos and at these events. And it comes from a culture. It's not something that is entirely random, but it exploits these moments of critical mass where a protest or a mob even becomes riotous. And I wanted to know who the heck is doing this, because nobody could answer.
Okay, so what is the answer?
The answer is, well, it's not who I thought it was. So what's funny is in 2020, everything I was reading in the media was white supremacists, white supremacists, white supremacists. And I had a political interest in finding these white supremacists. I was sort of, I was a lifetime liberal and somebody who was very open about my family's political views and where I came from. My parents met at UC Berkeley in the 60s. And I always saw the left as being peaceful. My parents were pacifists. My dad did alternative service so he wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. And so he was on the Navajo and Hopi reservations with my mom. And so I was raised seeing the left as being pacifist. And that's not what was happening. And it took me until July, arriving in Portland. And I'm actually finishing the epilogue for my book, Culture of Confusion, which is about all of this 5-year study into how do riots start, who's doing it. And when I arrived in Portland in July of 2020, that was when the Department of Homeland Security was going up against activist protesters and using militant tactics. And militant is the correct word. So once I got to Portland, I realized there was this expansive culture of left-wing militancy that I didn't understand, that the press didn't understand, that the right-wing press didn't understand, because they singularly use the word Antifa as a catch-all, and it really doesn't tell us anything, especially when you have, the next president saying that Antifa is an idea. And that's the biggest understanding that we have is, yes, anti-fascism is an idea, but there is a movement surrounding this of autonomous groups that are decentralized and working autonomously and quite improvisationally at times. And that's what I was seeing in Santa Monica in 2020 on May the 31st. And that's what I was seeing in Los Angeles, June. It would have been the 8th. That was the Sunday where the stones were raining down on the highway patrol cars on Highway 101, and the Waymo cars were on fire. Everybody knows that day now across the country just by the images. And I knew exactly where to look, because it's not just the crowd. It's not just the mob. There are people who are bringing in organizing tactics, and these have been developed over time, and it's quite sophisticated because nobody knows where to look. And you may see the Waymo car, but do you see the guy who's dressed from head to toe in black in the corner, who's monitoring the whole thing? And I will show some video, and you can see him standing there in my video. I knew where to look. I was looking at this guy in the corner of my eyes. Now, there are different moments in that LA weekend of rioting in early June in which you see people in black bloc. And it's confusing because a lot of people are in black bloc.
Yeah, explain what black bloc means. Is that like a style of dress, or is that an organized group?
It's a tactic. It's not an organized group, but you could say the black bloc, and that would refer to the people who are using militant tactics in any given protest event. But Black Bloc itself is a tactic where you dress head to toe to anonymize yourself within the crowd. Therefore, anybody who is executing any kind of subversive activity, illegal activity, as it were, wouldn't be immediately identifiable. And this is a tactic that originates from Germany in the 1980s.
Oh, in the 1980s. And were these like sort of white nationalist kind of protesters?
No. This is Reagan. Actually, the first really big documented use of this was when Reagan came to visit Berlin in the 1980s, and there was a squatter scene in West Berlin and in Germany, and so there was this very radical subculture, and they started using the tactic of anonymizing themselves. And, first it was black leather jackets and ski masks and so forth. If you see the photos from the 1980s, it looks very different than Black Bloc today. Now, if you went on June the 8th and 9th to downtown Los Angeles, you would have seen that that dress, that tactic is essentially viral. People were showing up that could have been newbies, first time at a protest, dressing head to toe in black. And in Portland, this became very common, less so in Minneapolis, but in Portland in 2020, when I arrived here in July, when there was the conflict between federal agents and militant protesters nightly, because there was also headlines about a van that picked somebody up, and in the press, this was portrayed as federal agents are snatching people. That was 2020, July of 2020. But once I got here, I realized, this is what's going on. In Minneapolis, you'd see an occasional person. There was a fellow who was named as an Umbrella Man. They didn't know who he was. They thought maybe he was a white nationalist, but that person's never been identified by the ATF or the FBI successfully, or the Minneapolis police, even though a slew of headlines came out saying that this was a Hell's Angel, this was a white supremacist. So I had all of that going through my mind in 2020, which was essentially a red herring. It was sending me in the wrong direction, where I was showing up at Trump rallies trying to find the white supremacist groups, the people from Charlottesville.
Okay. So I want to kind of, maybe we could do like a little taxonomy of who shows up at these things, because I think like a lot of us who are either, watching watching videos or even going down, like I feel like if I had gone down to the protests on June, 8th, 7th and 8th and 9th here in Los Angeles, a lot of my nice friends were down there with their signs, and they were, going to meet at the coffee shop and then go down there. And, I've talked to people, Nancy Rommelman, for instance, has been on this podcast, and she's talked about her coverage of Portland. And I think she also covered the LA protests a couple of months ago. And, it seems like there are sort of layers of this. I mean, there's like the people who come during the day. And, I remember in Portland, there were like the moms that would, join hands. They would wear like the wall of moms. Yeah. Yes. So there are these like there's these different factions. And then it seems like after dark is when the dynamics change. So can you kind of go through like who is there, starting from the most, innocent, earnest young person with a sign to something more,
I would say
darker, literally.
Right. So you have to look at the beginning and end of this, and it's still ongoing in Los Angeles through the summer. There've been in front of the Federal Detention Center. There's been continued activity, but to look at this with two bookends, you have the No Kings protest, which happened, right? And that I did something interesting. I started in West LA and I moved my way towards downtown. And that was interesting because the friends with the signs, so to speak, if you went to Culver City or Westwood, it was very mainstreamed. Culver City was all very mainstream. But then I went to West Hollywood, I'd see an occasional person who had radical signage, an anarchist symbol, dressed head to toe in black, even somebody with a Darth Vader mask, sort of costumey. This was during the West Hollywood March on No King's Day. Then you get to Hollywood, then you get to downtown. And once you get to downtown, you realize there's a uniform here, that people were showing up again. The viral tactic of dressing head to toe in black to anonymize themselves. Everybody was, a high percentage of people were masked. I'd say 80% of people are wearing masks. And sometimes it's just a surgical mask, but then
like a COVID mask.
Like a COVID mask, right. And that's the number that 2020 did on us all, in a sense, in the protest scene. Now anybody can wear a mask. And so you have a crowd that's 80 to 90% masked at times, going up against a police front line. And this creates a whole new dynamic. That bookend of No Kings that I just described. Now let's reverse to June the 6th. And this is the important date, June the 6th of 2025 in Los Angeles. A action is called. And you have protest as protest, but you have direct action. And direct action, we talked about Black Bloc. Direct action is the other term that's been absent from mainstream understanding of how militant protest or militant riots work. And direct action can be nonviolent, but it also could be violent. And it welcomes what is euphemistically called diversity of tactics. In the cultural realm of leftist revolutionary politics, that means diversity of tactics means don't police the protest. Don't tell other people what protest is. And with this credo, you can move forward and people can do certain things. So it comes down to, well, who's going to call for militant tactics? On the 6th of June, there had just been sweeps in the Garment District, but also at a Home Depot down in Paramount, near Compton. And there was a synergy at that moment of where you had community, you had crowds coming out, you had people that were very upset, but you also had a few select legacy militants. These are people who I've seen active since 2020. And they all posted the same flyer to go down to the detention center in downtown Los Angeles. And there was a conversation that happened according to a tweet of one of the anti-fascist insiders. So among this group are also press people who are quite radical, who consider themselves press, but they have the inside track. And one of them who's quite honest, his name is Sean, he posted on Blue Sky that there's a conversation between those who want to give speeches and those who want to do something more. And he posts that in the afternoon of June the 6th. And that's a very telling post for me, probably one of the most significant, because that identifies the moment of tipping point. So these people who are advocates for militant tactics, who are against peaceful protest, have shown up. They've all used the same flyer to say emergency protest on June 6th. And then that's the night everything pops off, and everything goes up. Now, there's one group that has raised $2.5 million on GoFundMe that is at the center of this. And they raised it in 2020. And this group was the head of it. His name is Richie, was at the center of the Fairfax 3rd rioting and has gone on a podcast to talk about being there, and was one of the first people arrested at Fairfax and 3rd. That's when the police car...
Fairfax and 3rd Street,
yeah,
we should say. Yeah,
that was okay. May the 30th of 2020. So that's the day before Santa Monica. And during that day, you had police cars on fire in front of CBS studios on Fairfax in Los Angeles. It was quite dramatic. So on his account, which is called People's City Council, and this is a group that raised $2.5 million on GoFundMe. We don't need any Soros conspiracy theories. We don't need to connect it anywhere else than just grassroots militancy. 2.5 million. And this is during the Black Lives Matter protests and riots of 2020, that end of May into June of 2020. And his organization which advocates for against peaceful protest and for these tactics raises $2.5 million on GoFundMe.
What are we talking about when we're talking about like aggressive action? Like, are they armed? They don't have guns, presumably. What kinds of weaponry do they have? Is this just about kind of like throwing rocks or like getting in fistfights? What's actually at stake here?
I would say that the throwing the rocks thing is a big one. That's improvisational. In one of my clips, you see them mining projectiles from the sidewalk bed. So you have this landscaping bed of stones, and they're there chiseling out these rocks to then be thrown down below onto highway patrol cars on the 101 freeway. And you see that in my video. The other tactic, I broke each of these tactics down. So we see improvised projectiles, Molotov cocktails. Obviously, that's what set off the Waymo car fires. I arrived just as they were burning, so I didn't see the ignition point, but I did document the ignition point for the attempted burning of a highway patrol car down below on the 101, in which they throw a Molotov cocktail down and then are pouring accelerant, and you can see them pouring from the overpass above down below. Now, one thing that's important is that the people that you see in my video aren't necessarily the head tacticians, because another tactic here is get other people to do it, hand somebody else something, get the crowd involved. And that's a big part of it too. It makes it harder to trace the tacticians who brought a lot of this in.
Okay, and just to be clear, we're talking about the riots this past June, downtown LA. We're not talking about, we're kind of all over the place. We're not talking about 2020. We're talking about 2025, downtown LA. This was in the wake of the ICE raids.
That's when we see the mining of the sidewalk, the accelerant being poured down below, and those rocks that are mined out being thrown down by people who are dressed head to toe in black down below onto the CHP vehicles towards officers.
Okay, now just to steel man this a little bit, because I saw these videos, I know what you're talking about. I also asked myself, are we just seeing the same thing over and over again? Is this a relatively isolated incident? How representative is this of what was going on more broadly?
So within the context of downtown Los Angeles, that these tactics are active, it's confined to a very small geographical area, right? That area of the federal building and the 101 is where we saw those militant tactics. Then that goes back and forth from that area. That's where they were trying to get on the 101 because that makes the most noise. Once a protest crowd can get down overtake the on-ramp and shut down the freeway, it makes the biggest impact on the media, on LA.
It disrupts the entire flow of the city.
Yeah. Right. So that was the stress point those days of, so especially the 8th and 9th of June, 2025. The other location is the federal detention facility and the detention center. And so at the Metropolitan Detention Center, I think it's officially called, there's been a face-off that keeps reoccurring at that intersection. So it's not widespread like 2020 was, because 2020 went from downtown LA to Fairfax into Beverly Hills, into all the way to Santa Monica. 2020 did that not just in Los Angeles metropolitan area, but all across the country. So this is nothing like that. Likewise, here in Portland, where I've been finishing up my book, I went down there last night and I was talking to some of the anti-fascists and I was observing what was going on. There were only 2 dozen people probably in Bloc. And you had federal officers up on the roof of the ICE facility and they were firing pepper balls down, but did not deploy tear gas. So this is a very specific cultural milieu that comes together consistently, I would say, in a couple of cities: Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, New York City, to some extent, though it's hard to live in New York, let alone organize, stuff like this. So New York City is a little more amorphous, but the San Francisco Bay Area is another sort of question mark, because 2017 saw a lot of radical activity at UC Berkeley, but then that all kind of died down, and so it's not the center.
2017.
2017. That's right when Trump was elected the first time, and you had all of those Black Bloc mobs that came onto UC Berkeley to oppose right-wing speakers. And so you had riots and militant clashes between the militant right and the militant left. 2017, the Bay Area was very, very active. It was the first to start with militant action the night of the election. In other words, once he won, people were out marching that night in San Francisco. So, but San Francisco's been relatively quiet now. And then Minneapolis is the other one. And there's one important point, which is Minneapolis and Portland are kind of legacy sister cities when it comes to anarchist revolutionary politics. And I spoke to somebody who in the 1990s was part of Racist Action, ARA, and that was the precursor to what we call Antifa today. In other words, these were groups that would go up against the neo-Nazi punks in the club scene. And you had the anarcho-punks and the neo-Nazi punks in the 1990s. And he told me something interesting. He said that two Germans came and gave a workshop on the Black Bloc tactic in the early 90s. And the first city they went to was Minneapolis. And then the second city they went to was Portland. And I find that very interesting because
a workshop. What does that mean in a convention, in a hotel, a conference room with a whiteboard?
Right. It was a man and a woman, from what my source told me. He was a teenager at the time, and they got together and they talked about Black Bloc and what you could do. Now, similarly, the head of this group that I mentioned that raised $2.5 million in LA has appeared on podcasts just saying, look, this is how you can do actions. This is how you can do it. And so a lot of the sharing of information used to be in zine form. They'd print these zines, but now it's all obviously online. And then there's the old fashioned way, which is you just show up and talk about a project, give a workshop, share information that way in face-to-face,
Okay. I mean, I want to ask you, if some of these people have guns, depending on the city and depending on the gun laws. And I want to also ask you about January 6th. But before we move to that, back to LA, these demonstrations downtown, was this what you're describing with the Waymos and the throwing the rocks and the Molotov cocktails? Was that before or after the National Guard came? Because one of the big points of discussion has been whether the presence of the National Guard exacerbated this or if it was actually necessary to have them come in.
After. It's all after. It's the day. It's the day. It's the day that the National Guard comes in that everything goes haywire. In other words, the National Guard comes in that morning. I shoot video of them. It's on my Instagram. Jeremy Reporter is my handle. And that Instagram went viral much later. But that morning of the 8th, I am documenting the National Guard in front of the Metropolitan Detention Center. And I'm referencing the bollard, I think it's called, that had been broken up on the 6th. In other words, you have these columns of concrete. And the first tactic was documented by a conservative right, a guy named Anthony Cabasa, who's out there kind of, he's part of the, he's very open about being, part of the conservative right, goes up there, covers these riot moments, and he shows that they're breaking up with pickaxes, those bollards, and getting projectiles, which are then thrown, and the Department of Homeland Security releases the video from the inside of those rocks hitting the vehicles as they are right there on Alameda in downtown Los Angeles. So that happens on the 6th. So the militant action kicks off on the 6th, the bollards being stripped down, the projectiles. The 7th, there's a big clash in Compton Paramount, right? Because the Paramount was where the Home Depot was swept, and they made federal ICE officers detain people and arrested people and so forth. And so you had this big clash on the 7th. Then on the morning of the 8th, the National Guard is brought in. And then on the 8th is when it really gets massive as a response in some ways to it. More people come in. But the consequence is that the images then, people don't have a timeline in their head, right?
Yeah.
So the images that you get are, well, I guess it was out of control, even though it was confined to a very, again, the Metropolitan Detention Center, and then this skirmish that happened in Compton on the 7th, which is before everything goes down on the 8th with the 101 freeway and the Waymo cars.
Okay. And I also just want to pause and explain what a Waymo is for people who don't live in these cities where we have them. This is a self-driving car. And is it a Google product? I can't. It is.
It is
okay.
a Google
yeah.
car. I believe we should check that, but that's always been my understanding. The Waymo there's an app now. It was beta tested for a long time. So in the San Francisco Bay Area and LA, you would see these driverless cars, but now it's in full effect. I think my parents have it on their.
Okay. I actually thought they didn't come over to the east side. I thought they were still only on the west side. I don't know because I was surprised that they could actually order a Waymo from downtown and it would arrive. But, these are electric vehicles and they have lithium batteries.
Right.
And these are leftist protesters who saw fit to set them on fire and release toxins into the air.
Right. So this was a big thought that I had back in 2020 when I was in Seattle and watching leftist, Black Bloc protesters burn trash, like plastic trash bins, and set them on fire, which was like, how's that good in any way?
No. And we know, we just had the fires here in Los Angeles, and a big point of discussion were the number of electric vehicles that burned in the fires, and just the way that the poison has literally seeped into the soil, and it has added to the overall toxic effect of the wildfires. And then to have just people make a point of ordering a Waymo so they can set it on fire is just it beggars belief.
And why did they do it? A reporter from the Washington Post asked me this, and it's a question I would have asked back in 2020 myself. Why the Waymos? Why this? In other words, seeking some meaning in what happened, negative or the consequences, which is obviously releasing all these toxins in the air, or otherwise. The answer is very simple. It's because it was there. It was there, and they knew it was a vulnerable target, but also it was a target it's a driverless car.
It's not going to kill a person.
You're not going to kill a person,
ostensibly.
Right? So it's
that's nice of them.
It's the perfect opportunity, right?
But okay, so do any of these people have guns? Why don't they? They don't seem to care.
So the leftist militancy is very pro-gun because it's anti-cop. So it believes, the people who are sort of hardcore tacticians on the ideological side of this are not about defunding the police. They're about abolish the police. And that was the big misdirect, which was people were arguing about defund the police, but the protesters, and I think there's a New York Times article that says, yes, we mean literally abolish the police. The protesters and one of the founders of Black Lives Matter also were in common cause with this idea that abolishing police and prisons was a step towards quote unquote liberation. So that's how radical the positioning is. And what that means is you should defend yourself. So they're very much about the First Amendment. Now, obviously, if you're in DC,
the Second Amendment. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I don't know how much they like the First Amendment.
Sorry. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. The second brain glitch there. No. So the people who are organizing are very much about the Second Amendment because they are against the police because they are for the militia, so to speak, the people's militia, as it were. So if you go to a state, Georgia, for example, I went to dueling protests. This is the end of 2020, after the election in December. So you have the Stop the Steal protesters on the right wing who are showing up, and they're all open carrying with long guns. And then you have Atlanta Antifa that's showing up, and they're dressed head to toe in black, and they're carrying long guns. And it's a sticky situation, in the sense that I saw this in Kentucky, in Louisville, Kentucky too, where different militias it was called the Not Fucking Around Coalition, which was a black nationalist group that was an all-black militia, and then you had another militia that was showing up, and he was the angry Viking, and you kind of held your breath. And
not the Viking we know from the from January 6th.
No,
that's a
different Viking.
Different Viking.
That's
the red, white, and blue face paint.
That's the QAnon shaman.
QAnon shaman.
Yes, Chancey. Right. Yeah. No,
I've been trying to get him on the podcast. It's hard.
This is a
different dream guest, okay.
Right? Yeah. No, I hear he's been running for office or something. So, but yeah, different Vikings in different parts of the country. But sometimes, obviously, you get this sort of heritage buffs that show up with guns. That is that is a rough sort of edge of this, which is that if people keep doing that, which is mass groups showing up with guns. In 2020, the thought that I had was, this can't be good.
Well, I mean, can they show up in California or Minneapolis or Portland with guns? I mean, they can't, right?
You can in Oregon. Gun laws are much more lax. In California, you can't. In other words, you can't open carry in California. But in Washington and Oregon, you can't. Gun laws are different. And so this is what made the Pacific Northwest particularly volatile in the lead up to 2020 and even through 2021. Now it's calmed down, but I was here in 2021 in the Portland area where there was an all-out brawl at this abandoned Kmart where the Proud Boys were holding a rally, and then a group of anti-fascists and Black Bloc showed up, and there was, from my understanding, there were a lot of people, the old school anti-fascists, that thought this would be a bad idea, and it was, to show up to the Proud Boys rally, firing mortar fireworks next to a Chevron station. And my video of this, it just looks like absolute chaos because you see all of these flares burning, the Proud Boys are shooting paintball guns, and they chase them for the better part of a half mile to a mile and create a complete public safety hazard. Now, the head of the Proud Boys, who got 8 years for that, because it stops being self-defense once the group comes to oppose you, and then you launch a counteroffensive through the town, going through major city streets and then bashing out cars of the windows of the cars of the anti-fascists where they've all parked at a school. So it was just, that was the kind of stuff that was going on between 2016, even earlier, and 2021 in the Pacific Northwest. And with the Proud Boy named Tiny Toezi, with his 8-year sentence, it was kind of a messaging, I think, from authorities of cut this stuff out. So you don't get the clashes between the far right and the far left anymore. But also volatile was people could be permitted to conceal carry or carry firearms, and that's just how the gun laws are different in the Pacific Northwest than California. And so you did have a man shot and killed who was a right-wing affiliate of kind of the Patriot Prayer was another group. Was Proud Boys, this cultural milieu of right-wing militants who would show up and then draw out the left because the left would come and counter them. A guy was shot and killed in that summer of 2020 before the election. a fellow named Aaron J. Danielson, and Michael Reinl was somebody who had not been active before 2020, but when the May 2020 revolution, as it were, started happening, by June, everything that he was posting on his Instagram was "I am Antifa," and it was all revolutionary politics. Everything before that was not.
What was he into before that?
It was pictures of family and nature, and he was former military, but his Instagram was not a hotbed of radicalism. And so that moment and responding to the moment was something that swept him away, and he ends up shooting and killing this person on the right wing, Danielson, and then he is on the run. And I think Vice News does an interview with him days before federal authorities track him down. There's a standoff, and he's killed extrajudicially by federal.
So I'm really curious what you can tell us about sort of cognitive profile, the psychological profile, the interests of people who get drawn into these far left military groups, because I think we know, or at least we think we know a lot about people on the right, because like the New York Times and the mainstream media is happy to tell us about all the conspiracy theories and all the kind of nonsense that, far right militias get mixed up in. But I think we don't really understand what the left version is. I think maybe we think, oh, this is like, there's a bunch of college students that took a little too many, sort of Marxist theory classes and got all confused. Or like, this is, people are sort of well-meaning, but then, I don't know, maybe there was one bad apple. So like, what draws somebody into this? And like, who are they? How old are they? Do they live in the city where this is happening?
Yeah.
Tell us.
Well, this was my comment also that I made to the Washington Post, which is that the left wing doesn't report on it. The cultural left doesn't report on its militants. In other words, if you consider yourself left of center, you're not going to go out there and break down who these people are. So consequently, when these viral moments happen, it's this right to center right ecosystem that grabs these moments and is talking about this. But that becomes very simplistic, right? Foot soldiers for the Dems. And you get these kind of talking points that try to make political hay out of it. It's not to say that it's not a political liability for the left. It definitely is. But as far as who's there in a protest, I would break it down into three sectors. First of all, you do have old school tacticians, old school anarchists or sharps. I don't know if that's a term that people are familiar with. The sharps were the skinheads against racial prejudice. So when we go back, even before anti-racist action, I talked about the skinhead wars of the 1990s. Even if you go back to like the late 80s, the sharps were very active in the skinhead scene, the anti-racist skinhead scenes. That was what was so funny, is that you had neo-Nazis and you had anti-racists, and they dressed the same way.
Yes.
in the suspenders and the Fred Perry polos and the Doc Martens and so forth, and then they'd go battle it out in the club scene. So you do have these old school guys, and I would see this one guy in the San Francisco Bay Area who had this tattoo over his clavicle of a storm petrel, which is the bird of revolution from Russian literature. And so they're really into it, and they're really into Spain and like this anti-fascism in Spain, and some of them even just moved to Spain. So you have this old school kind of post-weather underground revolutionary political. I guess you could say that they're just the hardcore, Gen X and old.
And are they like are they even Gen X? Are they in their 60s now? Like these are old, these are probably boomers. I mean,
right. They almost.
If they were into this if they were in their, well, yeah, I don't know. They're old Gen X. If they were in their 20s in the 1980s, I guess.
The last I saw some of these guys was in the San Francisco Bay Area, when there was one day before the 2020 election where a bunch of right-wingers were going to do an anti-tech protest. And the guy who organized it had his two front teeth like bashed out before it could even start. And this was like only a dozen of them showed up. And then you had a mob.
Yeah, because they couldn't organize. They're not using tech. How are they going to do an anti-tech protest? Are they just put staple pamphlets to telephone poles?
Well, they're anti-big tech. So they were. So this was all. So this was all on Facebook or on Twitter, as it was called then. But so two groups, Antifa Sacramento and Berkeley Antifa, showed up, and they amassed. And so if you ask yourself, well, who's in that crowd? I saw the old school guard that I was talking about, this guy with a Sharps jacket who, looked in his 60s and so forth. And they were marshaling around this young group of shorter kids in Black Bloc. And in my experience, a lot of them are college students or recently graduated or still in college. But organizing high school kids is a thing too, which is there was a group called the Pacific Northwest Youth Liberation Front, and they were very active in 2020. And they were teenagers and high school kids that were getting into the radical scene. So it is young people. And then the third element that I would describe is not just who's ever there, but in LA, particularly in Minneapolis, in the days after the George Floyd, murder and subsequent rioting, there was an urban there was a desire with these tacticians, the old school ones, and they wrote about this back in the 2000s to use the moment when you have a rebellion. And so what do they mean by that? A rebellion in a lot of these situations would be the people who are reacting in that moment. So in the case of George Floyd, the communities that were there, some of them wanted to protest peacefully. But what happens when the militant tactics come in, when the AutoZone is burning? Then what happens to that crowd? They get swept up with the moment. And that was the theory, was that there is a crying need. That's the quote from an anarchist handbook from the 2000s called the Love and Rage Revolutionary Anarchist Handbook, New York edition, New York local. You could find that online. It's in a PDF. And the passage, I cite this in my book, that I find so significant. I was going through it with this source of mine who was an old school anarchist. And he said, there it is. That's the passage. A crying need to mobilize the rebellion into a sustained revolutionary action. I'm paraphrasing there, but what they mean, or what they identified, was since Rodney, this was in reference to 1992, Rodney King, they were referencing since that quote unquote rebellion, much like the Minneapolis quote unquote rebellion of 2020, there was a need to mobilize these moments into sustained challenges of the capitalist system. So then who is that third group? You have the old school tacticians and ideologues. You have the young ones who are a constant new supply that are coming in and then moving on with their life, which I noticed. I was down at the ICE facility, and even one of the anti-fascist documentarians told me, he said, I don't know any of these people. They're all new, So you have this constant, what do you call it? Turnover of new people coming in from the early 20s to teens to early 20s. And then you have, in those big moments, you have the crowd, you have the people who are potentially rebelling in that moment from the big event. And in the case of the ICE raids, most recently.
So are those people who are directly affected by what's going on? Because again, I was looking at the videos of Los Angeles, and it did seem like I was seeing a lot of, Latinos down there, a lot of like people who looked like, it could be their family members who were in detention. And then I was like, well, what's their stake in this? And like, is there like gang involvement? Like, are the Antifa organizers sort of recruiting big, strong, tough gangbanger types to be with them?
So I don't think it's as deliberate or as laid out as that. I think what happens is they call a militant protest, And it's all happening in the moment. So people are angry. If you're on the front lines and you're bringing in a tactic, you're a guy who's dressed head to toe in black, who has a pickaxe, you're hammering away. People see that and respond to it. People see the Waymo car and it's a smoke signal. This is what I've said, that it's a smoke signal that nobody is in control that day. So all of a sudden, the crowd can jump in a different way. I don't think it's as deliberate. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's handing somebody a Molotov cocktail, sure. But it's not as, or it's decentralized, it's autonomous, it's improvisational. And that's the point is, then it's harder to trace, right? You can't conspire if you don't know who you're conspiring with, if it's just happening in the moment. So it's by design that these tactics and what comes to transpire is very hard to decode, because it's baked in to what leftist revolutionary tactics are, which is there's a reason that the Proud Boys got, for January 6th, right? The head of the Proud Boys got, what was it, 18 years? They had these lengthy sentences because they were able to go through and show organization, top-down, centralized organizing. So Enrique Tarrio, who's not even there at January 6th, he's expelled from the city the day before, gets one of the harshest cities. I can't remember if it was 18 or 22. It was this very lengthy sentence. And the reason that it becomes so traceable is because you have all of these communications. You have all of these, they might not have ever explicitly said even, we're going to take the Capitol, but they were planning other Occupy style tactics, and they were discussing them, and they were coordinating with branches of other people. So when you do that and you're centralized, you leave yourself open to prosecution in a way that these anti-fascists have very cleverly, / anarchists have very cleverly figured out a way to subvert, which is this autonomous organizing.
Is that because they're more intelligent? They went to college. They organized at San Francisco State.
Well, it's a longer tradition. It's a longer,
right.
This right-wing thing is very new, and it's very much a cultural appropriation of the left. Like January 6th is very much, I would say, a response to everything that was happening in 2020, in which they used the tactics. Now, I did find one white supremacist at January 6th who I interviewed on January 7th. And he gave me probably one of the most interesting quotes. But he was kind of identified as one of these nativist, kind of murky identitarian types who said he didn't have a problem with National Socialism. If that's not clear enough, I don't know what it is. So this guy shows up. He's from Irvine, California, but he doesn't have any friends. I wanted this to be the big story, that I uncovered the white supremacists that I had been looking for since 2020 on January 7th when I was there. But he didn't have any friends. He was a complete loner. But he gave this quote, which I think is relevant across the right-wing cultural sphere, which was, he said, "We use their tactics in a Sun Tzu fashion to take our country back," is what he told me. And I think that is actually accurate. That's what was going on.
A Sun Tzu fashion?
Yeah,
what does that
the
mean?
art of war, right? That you take your enemies' tactics and you use them against them. And I think that's what was happening on January 6th, that people were showing up with helmets, gas masks, even a skateboard on January 6th to use these soft instruments to instigate rebellion and riot. And so when you ask me, were there guns? If you ask, are there guns on January 6th? The answer is yes, but they're very few, considering that you have a crowd of tens of thousands of people. You only have, less than half a dozen gun arrests, and you have one documented incident of a person firing in the air. That's a crowd that's probably almost 100,000, according to Secret Service estimates. So are there guns? There are, but they're, the soft tactics, the soft instruments, the soft militancy is what has gone viral for anybody, really.
When you talk to these leftists, the Antifas and the people in their circles, what do they want? What kind of world do they want? Do they have a vision, or are they just kind of in it for the chase?
I think a lot of it is the chase. I was talking with this anti-fascist photographer last night, and we were talking about the darker side of this, which is that it's addictive behavior, and it's addictive behavior to cover it as well. And there's been a lot of I've been on this for 5 years, and there's been moments where I stepped out. I went to Hawaii for a while and reported on air there just to kind of clear my head and recenter myself. But there are people who do this as activism and work, where they are working for some kind of I think there are different nonprofit media organizations and so forth, and I would like to find out more about that. But this fellow who I was talking to, his name was John. We were talking about the darker side of this, which is that it's addictive. People keep going, but then at some point they see something, a point where things go too far, and maybe they extract themselves from it. But what was the question again? I'm sorry.
Well, do they have some utopian vision? If they're going to abolish the police, and then what?
Right. Well, that's the big question: is is the big picture really? Do they really see that and say, this is what we're going to usher in, this new era? And I think there are true believers. I think that this fellow who raised $2.5 million does believe that a challenge to the capitalist system can happen through this direct action if you get enough people. And I think 2020, we saw something similar to that, also where the media was on the side of the quote unquote revolutionaries. That the media was all of a sudden printing a lot of social justice based content that was not critical of what was going on the street. So I think there is the idea that if you do overwhelm certain centers of power, whether it's media or academia or so forth, that you can bring in this change. So there are believers. It seems extremely impractical to me. It always has since 2020. Just the moment that I heard abolish the police, and the first question that comes to mind is, and then what? Mm-hmm. But yeah.
I have a lot of guests on this podcast that talk about things like the masculinity crisis and the mental health crisis among young people, and just sort of the lack of places to put your energy, like literally physical energy. Like we're in a world where everyone's on their screen. I mean, these are all obvious things to say, but they're true. People are very sedentary. There's not a lot of people are not going into the military, for instance. People are out of shape. Do you think that some of this is just sort of displaced aggression? Like if we were in a different kind of culture, would a lot of these guys be doing different things? And for that matter, are there women doing these things? I have seen Black Bloc women protesters. What's their deal?
Yeah, there are, absolutely. And I was in Denver. This is a funny story. I was in Denver and I was following this march. The guy next to me had a full tattoo of Joseph Stalin's face. They call them, they're tankies. Tankies are the Stalinists, the ultra militant side of the revolutionary left. But I one of the people at the end who was bringing up the rear of the protest, she motioned for me to catch up with the group because I had stopped to take a picture of one of Denver's digital signs that was showing Black Lives Matter art, and I thought it was interesting. I was filming it, but she hollered to me and she said, "Hurry up, little brother," giving me this kind of Maoist pet name. And then I catch up to her and she gave me a big slap on the ass, which I thought was kind of funny. I was like, oh, okay, this is about subverting
Yes.
power roles a bit. And so I think that that does play into it, that people are getting into the organization and the power. For example, at the ICE facility in Portland, one of the first people that comes up to me is giving me an ideology check of sorts, or at least, do I belong there? He says, have you been here before? And I said, yes, I have. I hadn't at that time since, I think, 2021, but it was still a truthful answer. But there's this thing of once you're organized in this group, that you have power to then vet certain people to control that environment. The we keep us safe space, that this is our space, whose streets, our streets, that the people are plugging in, I think, definitely for a sense of control and of making the statements that they want to make against the system in this counterculture, in the subculture. And they're doing it, I think, in a way that empowers. And there's a theatricality to it sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just, being wild and over and expressive and theatrical.
Well, there's a LARPing quality. I
Right.
mean, we saw this. I mean, that was the whole Kyle Rittenhouse thing. I mean, he was kind of the ultimate LARPer. And
Well, what's interesting about Rittenhouse was
this is Kenosha, by the way,
Yes.
people. We're shifting again, but
We're
talking about
shifting time to 2020.
Kenosha,
We're back in 2020,
Wisconsin.
Kenosha. What's really interesting about Rittenhouse is that he wasn't just a LARPer, because obviously once you have a gun, there's it's not just the LARP, because you're using the LARP, live action role play, by the way, for all of these people who show up in these theatrical elements. But he's not wearing a mask. He's not. He's equipped with a gun and a first aid kit. So if he's LARPing, he's doing a very good job of LARPing as a Boy Scout. In other words,
yes, he wanted to be a medic. I mean, he wanted to say he really thought he could save the day. I mean, it was such a
video
need
of him treating Black Lives Matter protesters that have been hit by rubber bullets and so forth. So the militia thing takes everything away, is a very different thing than the LARP thing, which is the soft weaponry that I've been discussing, the theatricality. The militia thing, all of a sudden you're into a very serious expression of both the First and Second Amendment, because these militias that showed up even at Charlottesville in 2017 were not on the side, quote unquote, of the white supremacists, the people with the Nazi flag or the identitarian right. They were there in the power vacuum, much like the Kenosha militias, one of which started their walk with No Lives Matter Until Black Lives Matter, one of the Kenosha militias. But very similarly, in 2017, the militias are there to step into the power vacuum, because they know that the police have absented themselves in these situations, and they are trying to guarantee First and Second Amendment rights. So obviously the right to free speech and the right to bear arms. And so that becomes a whole different understanding of what's going on. The militia adds this. And when you conflate the militia with the militant scene, then that adds to the confusion, because they're two very different things.
So as somebody who's been at a lot of these things, obviously, do you think, generally speaking, the National Guard should not come in? That makes it worse?
It's impossible to answer, in the sense that I can answer it in both ways, which is the immediate response was it exacerbated the situation, because obviously then you give everybody a reason to mobilize that day. Everybody gets the word the National Guard is there on a Sunday, where everybody has time to come out. And that's when you get the biggest day. That's when you get the Waymo images. That's when you get the 101 freeway, cop vehicles being pummeled. So it exacerbates the situation, in the sense that the crowd mobilizes now against the system, right? Because you have the federal action from Donald Trump, no less, that is kicking it into the next level. But then you ask the question, well, what if nobody does anything? And if nobody does anything, we saw that in 2020 to some effect, which is then it just it can spread unfettered across the city. But that also depends on what what the temperature is. COVID had a lot to do
Right.
with 2020 and people being shut in and then going out for the first time. So 2020 was a perfect storm in a lot of ways. So I don't know that you can necessarily say that would
Yeah.
happen, but the argument for the National Guard was, hey, look, we stopped something from even bigger happening. So a lot of what happened on June the 8th, the big day in LA, I thought played into Trump's hands. And I had said that very publicly, that this stuff is it's an election killer, because it's a liability to the left, because everything gets misdirected. There's no self-critique of this is a culture that is thriving in the
Yeah.
left-wing sphere that brings in this militancy. And the press doesn't report on that. The only time that they have, the Washington Post, if you Google Antifa 2017 Washington Post, you'll be transported to another parallel universe where the Washington Post is very critically talking about leftist militancy and very accurately reporting in their headlines, peaceful right-wing protesters attacked. And after 2017, something happened. They stopped doing those kind of stories.
Peaceful right-wing protesters attacked where?
This is UC Berkeley.
Okay. And was this before or after Charlottesville?
So that would have been before. In the lead up to Charlottesville, if you look at Trump's election, then you have some demonstrations, especially in California, some light rioting, but then everything really happens in DC on his inauguration. There's even a plot. It seems like it's out of a Batman movie to pump in gas into a right-wing event of right-wing influencers called the Deplorable. And this plot is foiled by a right-wing journalist and authorities. But in the meantime, if you look at the video, there's people breaking out windows in DC. People who were attending the inauguration in these after parties were having things thrown at them. There were people in Bloc running rampant on DC. So that's the very first day of the Trump presidency, the inauguration. Mm-hmm. Then you have UC Berkeley, and you have this series of 4 different events, the fourth one only, which is doesn't spin into violence, in which leftist militancy goes against those who want to see Milo Yiannopoulos or Ann Coulter or Ben Shapiro speak at UC Berkeley.
Right.
Then Charlottesville follows that. And Charlottesville is the big one where everything sort of tightens up, right? Because we saw actual Nazi flags and somebody get killed because they were hit with a car by one of the white identitarian, ethno-nationalists. And so all of that sort of happens, and we forget that that's everything that leads up to 2020. And
right, exactly. Well, just to put a button on this, I have one last question, and I don't know if you can answer it specifically, but I think that the salient image of 2025 Los Angeles protests was the guy standing on the car, holding a Mexican flag, masked. In my memory, I feel like he's holding an assault rifle, but that can't be right. What does he have in his hands? Just describe this photo.
The flag. And
the flag?
He's bare-chested. And he's standing on top. Now, my intuition, I can't know for sure, but my intuition is that's not the guy. In other words, the guy who does the tactic isn't standing on the car afterwards. Mm-hmm. It's always someone else.
So who is that guy? Like somebody they recruited because he looked good standing on a car?
He's a guy in the moment. He's a guy in the moment. So I want to connect this to 2020 because a friend of mine ended up on the cop car at Fairfax and 3rd with a raised fist. This is somebody who, not very political at all, but ended up, and I was looking at my social media timeline just agog, and I was right down the street. I was supposed to go out that day, and then I I think that was the last moment that I just kind of froze. But I saw my friend on top of the car. Now my friend's obviously not the person who showed up with any intent of being on that car, but he ended up there and quickly deleted the post once businesses were burning on Melrose. Similarly, the person who does the Molotov cocktail, who hands it out or does it themselves or is coordinating with somebody else in their affinity group, is not the person that ends up in the car. They're off to the side. That's why my camera finds the person who's head to toe in black, and he has a red bandana that, because they tie themselves to the quote unquote intifada, right? To a lot of the student movement at UCLA. And they say this in their posts, in other words, that there's a legacy back to Ferguson where these tactics started to become popularized during the Michael Brown protests and riots of Ferguson, Missouri. And they draw this lineage. And this guy who's there by the Waymos has the red headband with the Arabic script on it.
Mm-hmm.
And you see him in my video. And I knew once I saw him, I said, that's the guy. That's the guy. And so I was sure to get some video of him. And then you see photos that were taken in the press, and you see him right there at the Waymo car when the fire is starting. And so you kind of have to know where to look because everything's so distracting. There's stuff that's going on that's in the moment.
Right.
There's people throwing lime scooters over the overpass so that it will fall down below to hit a patrol car or officer. And a lot of it, again, is improvised. Maybe one of the tacticians thought of it, but maybe not. Maybe somebody else just saw, well, there's Waymo cars on fire. There's limes. That's something else we can use. So a lot of it is of the moment.
What do you want people to understand about all of this that they really can't seem to understand?
that it's a real thing, I guess. It's taken me years on Facebook of debating, my friends from high school on the left who just can't see that this is happening, and it's happening in an organized manner, and that it should be called out. And my question to the anti-fascists is if you really are sincere about a movement, no movement is going to happen completely clandestine. Why aren't you open about what you're doing if your cause is just, and so forth? Those are the questions that go unanswered when I talk to the militants who know who I am and I know who they are. But I think that one question that I asked somebody here in Portland too, an anti-fascist, was doesn't this all help Trump? It all comes down to this question to me. And the New York Times did a write-up of when I started documenting this in 2020, and I said that my fear is that this will get Trump reelected, which I believe that it eventually did, that the media's inability to report on this becomes a liability, not just for the left, but for the media itself. Why are we seeing these things happen online and nobody's telling us what it is? And so other theories fill the void naturally. But at the heart of it is people can't believe that the story's not being told, and it's not being untangled, and it's not being presented. There is a desire, I think, when you're in the mainstream media to say, this is a small fraction, but this is the actual cause that you should be looking at. But in doing that, you undermine your own credibility, because you're not saying, well, what is this thing then? What is the organization? What is this guy dressed head to toe in black that I'm seeing? Where is he getting his money? What is happening? And the inability for people to untangle that and present it in the mainstream media sphere has I think, hurt, again, both the left and the media itself.
What are you more afraid of, the right-wing militants or the left-wing militants?
The thing about the left-wing, when I've walked into a space, even when I was at January 6th, because I was expecting to see a brawl that night between the Proud Boys and anti-fascist groups, which were led in DC by not a named Antifa group, but a group that was called the They Them Coalition. And that group was very instrumental back in 2020, this would have been, end of 2020. There were 3 different riotous events, January 6th being the third of them. So I arrived there and I was expecting to see that happen. But when I was in that crowd in January 6th, I didn't have to watch my back from the crowd itself in the way that I do the minute I walk into a Black Bloc leftist space. Now, in LA, the crowd was so massive that I could kind of move very without being inhibited, because that week in June in 2025, everything was so massive. But you have to watch yourself. Here in Portland, where again I'm finishing up this book, like I walked up to people, and the first thing is I'm being probed, I'm being checked ideologically. That is an unsettling feeling, especially if that were able to gain the traction that it did in 2020, because we saw that manifest not just on the street, but that's an expression also of what happened in universities, online.
Right.
That kind of pile on and conformity scares me in a very unique way. Now, the stuff that can happen on the right by a lone individual, this is the flip side of it. And the Southern Poverty Law Center is very quick to point this out. And you get this talking point of, don't look at the left, because this is much more scary over here on the right. Because one person can do a lot of damage when they show up with their gun and go lone wolf. So that's always a concern. But there's an important distinction, which is those, again, much like I separate the militants, political militants, with the militia, you also have to look at lone wolf shooters differently too, because they're not differentiating if they're shooting a Republican or an independent or a Democrat. These are very often.
Well, some of them. I mean, you're a particular kind. It doesn't differentiate, but
right.
Many of them do.
But then you do have the case in Minnesota, where a state official is murdered. And so you do have this person who has a list of left-wing targets. So when I say the mass shooters, these are all very different things.
Oh, sorry. The mass shooters are indiscriminate.
Mass shooters are indiscriminate about who they're. But then you get the Steve Scalise situation where the person shows up. The leftist shows up at the Republican baseball practice, and then you have this situation in Minneapolis where you have a lone wolf who has a whole list of left-wing, Democrats, and that's scary. That's scary in its own right.
Yeah.
So they're both frightening for different reasons, I guess you could say. But the right has a much more robust, I would say, ability to talk about these things. In other words, I think we're on the left, there is a fear to just have the conversation about, well, who are these people? What tactics are they using? What do they want? What is their ideology? Because they don't want to see symmetry then between, oh, well, they want this, and people who want this on the social justice left also want that. They don't want to frame it that way.
Right. It's almost like the left has more cognitive dissonance around it.
I would say, I mean, there's a group, right, called Patriot Front, which is the white supremacists from Charlottesville. If anybody, I was wondering for a long time, well, what happened to the Charlottesville people? Well, the remnants of that, they walk around DC every once in a while in different parts of the Midwest with mummified faces. They wear this white mask as opposed to a black mask, obviously, not very subtle, but and they walk around with their weird flags and do their thing, and those are the white supremacists, the ethno-nationalists, the blood.
So they're goofy. That's the thing, is they're goofy. Like it's hard to take them seriously.
It's very hard to take them seriously. They're extremely goofy. These are the blood and soil types, right? The ones that were holding the tiki torches and so forth. So now they're running around like mummies, and the whole thing is very weird. But the right calls that out at times. At times, maybe they won't. But there's a well-known video of the March for Life in Chicago where the Patriot mummies showed up, and the March for Life people said, "Get the hell out of here. We don't want you."
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that doesn't happen on the left. You don't get people dressed head to toe in black showing up and somebody saying, "You know what? You're gonna have to take that somewhere else." So that's the big difference.
Interesting. Do you think that's going to change? Are they going to, is it because of lack of leadership on the left? We really do have to wrap up, but I feel like I can just keep asking you more and more questions. Why? Why is there nobody to say, hey, get out of here?
Again, it's this principle of diversity of tactics is don't police the protest. All of these memes, there's been this mimetic energy from 2020 also, which says your camera is a cop, meaning don't film us, don't film what we're doing. And a lot of the younger generation has really absorbed a lot of these directives. And so they're showing up with the openness to these tactics. And if you're somebody who's an old schooler, and we saw this in 2020, that there were some kind of old schoolers who were like, look, we don't want this to be a violent protest. We don't want people showing up. And I saw this in Portland too, where there's one guy who would come out, and it was one man against the world in the sense that he was on the left and he was on a bullhorn saying, I know you're going to go after that federal building next, like you do every night. We don't want it. But he was yelling into the void because he was overwhelmed, and there's nobody that's willing to stand by him. If he's the one man with a bullhorn that's saying, let's not use violence, he's going to be alone. Nobody else is going to rally to his side. And that's where the biggest danger is.
It's leftist groupthink. It's almost like they hyper-intellectualize their way out of any kind of strategy. It's almost like they're in some kind of like philosophy class, and like, here's how I can like do the mental gymnastics so I can justify this violence on my own side because there's some kind of like higher ideology that we supposedly share. I don't know.
And fear. It's a fear of being ostracized, right? If you're going to take on, I've always approached this from a nonviolent perspective. That's in my origin. That's who my parents were in the 60s and so forth. And so if you present it through that lens of nonviolence, I feel confident that is a path to argue against this, that the violence in the end does not help the causes, that it does not, it only empowers and emboldens, in my opinion, the justification for the National Guard to be brought in and all these moves by Trump. It only helps them.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating, Jeremy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I could go on and on, but we've got to wrap up. Tell us where we can find you and tell us about your book, Culture of Confusion, that's forthcoming.
So I'm very excited. I've been working on that book for 5 years, Culture of Confusion, and mostly online. You can find me under the handle Jeremy Reporter, and that goes for mainly Facebook and Instagram. That's become, since those censorship levers have been sort of removed, my work has been able to thrive. I was never good on Twitter or X because I was very nuanced and long-winded, and so I never caught tribal fire on Twitter X. But I'm still there as Jeremy Reporter on that platform and on Substack as well, where I make the occasional cultural observation and so forth. So that's my handle, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thanks for what you're doing. That was my conversation with Jeremy Lee Quinn. He's an independent photojournalist who has spent the last 5 years documenting protests all over the country. He has a forthcoming book, Culture of Confusion. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like the show and you are not yet a paying subscriber, please consider becoming one on Substack. This is a great time to do it. I will be back next week with another super nuanced guest. See you then. Thank you.